BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jaega Wise, and in this episode of the Food Programme, I'm looking at one of the most common types of food additive found in our diets, emulsifiers. In the kitchen, emulsifying is something you can do easily. For example, take oil and egg yolk. If you whisk them together with some vinegar, you get mayonnaise, fully binded, blended together with a consistent texture. But that's not what we're making in the kitchen today, because this programme is about industrially manufactured dietary emulsifiers, sometimes listed on food packets as thickeners, stabilisers or gelling agents. More on that later. Emulsifiers are found in mass-produced bread and bakery items, chocolates, ice creams, salad dressings, yogurts, plant-based milks and much, much more. A study in 2023 of ultra-processed foods on sale in UK supermarkets found emulsifiers to be present in more than 50% of the more than 32,000 products on sale. But some food categories use them more than others. In pastries, buns and cakes, 95% of them contain emulsifiers. If you're looking at the labels, you'll also notice how common it is to find foods containing more than one kind of emulsifier. That same study found 51% of the emulsifier-containing foods containing more than one type. There's been a lot of hype and attention given to ultra-processed foods recently because, let's face it, we eat a huge amount of them in the UK, and their health credentials, they're not good. There's a significant body of research now connecting their consumption with higher rates of obesity and diseases like type 2 diabetes, heart disease and cancer. But the discussion about the labelling of these foods as ultra-processed has led to other debates about how bad this large category of foods really are for us, and whether their negative effects are more to do with the fact that they usually come packed with lots of fat, sugar and salt, or whether it's down to the effects of their processing, and in particular to the additives they contain. In this programme, we're focusing on just one kind of additive used in ultra-processed foods: dietary emulsifiers. We're going to look at what they're doing inside our foods, their history, those health concerns that surround them, and the future of their development. To get us started though, I'm watching an emulsifier in action, working up a Parmesan foam.
Just giving it a good blend so it's completely dissolved into the liquids.
This foam, being made by Chef Ross Brown, is flavoured with Parmesan cheese and will be a topping for a mushroom risotto. Ross no longer works in restaurant kitchens, but told me when he started out 15 years ago, molecular gastronomy was all the rage. The ingredients for the foam are relatively simple: Parmesan-infused water and some sunflower lecithin. Lecithin is a fatty substance found in plant and animal tissues, including egg yolk. Often you'll see soy lecithin included as an ingredient in industrially produced foods, but there are other types.
Two main types of lecithin you can get is soy and sunflower, both made in very similar ways, and then they can stabilise many different things and improve textures, but for this we're going to stabilise the foam, so when the fat and air molecules get bound together to create the foam, when otherwise it would completely drop straight away, if you know what I mean.
And what about egg, lecithin from egg?
Yeah, well, I think it works in the same way, you know, for instance, so when you're making a mayonnaise, the egg is the emulsifier in that, and that is a lecithin in there. You can use lecithin in emulsifications that don't have eggs. So for instance, like vegan mayonnaises, if you were to add a very small amount of lecithin to your mayonnaise mix, that will keep it stable.
Ross now works for Sous Chef, an online specialty cooking supplies company, started in 2012 by Nicola Lando, whose kitchen we're in. As well as stocking lots of artisan products and beautiful utensils, her website also has a range of additives, including several emulsifiers.
So when we first started, the top Michelin star restaurants were all using these new ingredients, what were quite novel for them. So, you know, instead of using something like a big tablespoon of flour, which would actually take away some of the flavour of a sauce, they could use a couple of grams of one of these novel starches.
Nicola started selling additives to chefs and adventurous home cooks who wanted to have a go at recreating restaurant-type meals at home. She says they don't sell well anymore. Fashions change, and her range has shrunk over the years. But she still has a decent number, which she talks me through.
We've got xanthan gum. That is a fermented sugar, and so it kind of creates that thickener. Carrageenan, that's made from a seaweed. Agar agar, which is a vegan gelatin, it's called. That's also a seaweed-based product. Ice cream stabilizer, which is a blend of different things like sodium alginate as well, which is another seaweed-based product. I think I've got tapioca maltodextrin as well here. And that's, I think, used a lot in industry, which I'm sure you're talking about otherwise, to create volume in lower fat foods, replacing other products. But in fine dining, it's used to make kind of much more interesting, I guess, artistic food. Sodium alginate, that's another thickener. And that can be used as espherification. Many of the top restaurants were creating these liquids that they could then form into a sphere. It was a liquid, but also could almost be a solid and could explode in the mouth and was really exciting. So that's
I remember it was the restaurant industry's bubble phase. So what do these emulsifiers look like?
They're basically just a powder.
Okay. So that is literally a fine white powder. It looks like talcum powder.
Yeah, they're all extremely similar.
And do they have a taste?
Not really. I think one of the calciums, if you put it into the liquid, can taste quite bitter, but otherwise you'd be unlikely to taste it.
Ross, sous chef, sales manager and resident demonstration chef, then shows me a bowl of set balsamic vinegar and water he's made using agar agar.
So all it is great quality balsamic vinegar, water, sugar, and agar agar.
And it looks like and smells like a balsamic vinegar hard set jelly.
Yeah, so you could use that, for instance, as a setting agent for vegan desserts, which is commonly used for. What we're going to use for is to turn it into a fluid gel.
So how much of the agar agar white powder have you had to use?
That's 1.5%. If you're trying to set a liquid to a gel that is completely liquid, like water consistency, I'd go 1.5%. If it's a slightly thicker, like a looser puree consistency, you could go 1%.
So, do you mind if I try?
Yeah, go for it. It will be a hard texture because you'll see what it will turn into once it's blended.
I can't even get the spoon in it. That's quite a challenge. That's like a bouncy ball texture.
Yeah.
Okay,
it's quite brittle almost as well when you open it up.
Okay. That's the most strange sensation.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, jelly. Not finished jelly, the jelly cubes.
yeah. It's like overset jelly. Really, really strong set jelly.
And tastes like balsamic vinegar, which is exactly what it is. Okay, so what are you going to do with this?
So I'll show you what we do with it now. We take it over to this blender over here. If you wouldn't mind passing me a spoon, please.
It looks almost like a jam.
Yeah, and it will eventually become super smooth once it starts blending properly. Now you can see that it's turned into a smooth puree-like consistency.
Yes.
But it holds a perfect shape. So for instance, like restaurants that want to do like very, fine dining plating and quenelle a piece of puree that will hold exactly where you put it, and you could do a really nice dot on a plate that holds its shape. So this could go onto a warm plate and not melt.
And agar agar, is that a very common ingredient used in professional kitchens?
In fine dining kitchens, for sure, yeah. It's very consistent. If you use the correct dosage, it's going to bring you back the same result every single time. And especially in fine dining, everything is about consistency.
Consistency, of course, isn't just prized in fine dining. It's the backbone of modern food production too. As Ross plates up, piping the balsamic gel into delicate dots across the bowls of hot mushroom risotto and layering on the parmesan foam, Nicola shows me some modernist recipe books, mostly published more than a decade ago now, but which include lots of emulsifiers and other novel ingredients.
This is a book from Grant Ashat's A Linear cookbook. That still has 3 Michelin stars in Chicago. The recipe title's Wild Bass with Mushrooms, Red Wine, and several embellishments, which is like a pretty good way of talking about it. But it has a wild striped bass, which is the fish. And then on top, there's a very thin, very shiny, glistening layer of what they call thickened red wine glaze. And that recipe blends together red wine, port, some fruit, and also Ultratex, which is another one of these starches. In these kind of high-end cookbooks, the purpose of these emulsifiers seems to be for texture, really, and shape. And also flavour release. So different textures, different viscosities, and the different concentration of the emulsifier will also change the way you experience the flavour. How do you bring even more flavour? How can you make a beetroot taste more beetrooty? Would be an example.
Maximum beetroot.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me move the emulsifier jars out of the way.
Next, we taste Ross's mushroom risotto with balsamic gel, parmesan foam, and some added crispy onions.
That's so good. And very multi-textured.
Yeah.
So foam, crunchy,
Yeah.
creamy, sweet from the balsamic vinegar. Mm-hmm. It's not just flavour. its texture too.
Yeah, definitely. That's a massive part of cooking, is making sure you hit not only the sweet, salty, sour, all the classic ones, but making sure you have a soft element, a creamy element, a smooth, a crunch. That is such an important part of the eating experience, and I think even a small little thing like that, crispy onions, adds such a more pleasant eating experience when you've got a little bit of crunch and a little bit of texture in there as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for showing me how emulsifiers would be used practically in the kitchen. It's been very, very illuminating.
No worries. I'm glad you enjoyed.
Ross Brown and Nicola Lando from Sous Chef showing me how emulsifiers work and their role in professional kitchens. But what about the emulsifiers lots of us eat every day? In his book, Ultra Processed People, Dr. Chris Van Tulloken calls them bacterial slime, whilst Tim Spector, Professor of Epidemiology at King's College London and co-founder of the personalised nutrition company Zoe, and writer on gut health and food, often advises his social media followers to avoid eating them. I wanted to find out why these additives are drawing so much criticism, so I headed to Dr. Tim Spector's laboratory.
Basic, simple terms, these are products that are used in making ultra-processed foods stick together. So the way of making ultra-processed foods is to extract real foods in combinations that you wouldn't find in nature, and so they need to be re-glued together, essentially.
We've already heard about a few different types of emulsifiers from Ross and Nicola, but there are over 60 types approved in the UK. Tim pulled up the Food Standards Agency website to show me a few.
Well, as well as soy lecithin, which many people have heard of, there's carrageenan, there's acacia gum, guar gum, agar, which comes from seaweed, carboxymethylcellulose, mono and diglycerides, polysorbates, ammonium phosphatide. These are, just the common ones. And so understanding them is complicated because although you generally treat them as a group, they are often quite different in their properties.
What's the problem with having them in our food? Is there a problem with having them in our food?
We didn't used to think there was any problem at all until we started looking at gut microbes. Studies have clearly shown that a number of these have adverse effects on the health of our gut microbes. And these chemicals have been shown in mice to make them more likely to develop diabetes or become obese.
Are all emulsifiers the same in terms of those derived from plants, for example, pectin as an example, carrageenan as another one? Are they, in your opinion, going to be potentially as harmful to our gut microbiome as some of the more processed emulsifiers?
I think there's likely to be a range. The evidence so far is more damaging for some than others. So carrageenan and carboxymethylcellulose at the moment would appear to be more harmful than, say, soy lecithin. It's only really in the last 3 to 5 years that we've seen big epidemiology studies look at populations who eat a lot of ultra-processed foods. Those studies are showing increases in most common diseases, but they aren't able to break them down, obviously, into the individual items, and it's going to be virtually impossible to do that sort of epidemiology to work out which ones are particularly at risk. So until then, it is safe practice to avoid emulsifiers because even if they might vary in their effects on the body, they are generally a marker that that food has been tampered with in a way to make it more palatable, that's not in its natural form.
How hard or how easy is it to pin some of the gut microbiome damage, so to speak, on foods like emulsifiers?
You can't from epidemiology. I think we have to accept that. The only way to do this is in very detailed clinical studies. And I think we need to be seeing this done across the range of these foods because they've been given this safe status, which looks now to be completely false. And what we also expect to find, which the studies so far have suggested, is that there might be a personalised approach to this. So we'd likely in the future be able to predict which emulsifiers people are going to have problems with and which might be safer for them.
Professor Tim Spector. We contacted the Food and Drink Federation, which represents many of the companies producing foods that include emulsifiers, about these concerns, and it told us.
Food additives, including emulsifiers, play an important role in food and drink production to improve the texture, consistency and shelf life of products. All additives are independently scientifically assessed as safe by the Food Standards Agency. The FSA actively monitors the evolving science to ensure its decisions are based on the latest evidence.
We invited the Food Standards Agency, which assesses the safety of all additives, to join the programme. They declined, but told us.
Emulsifiers, like all food additives, undergo robust risk assessments before authorisation and re-evaluation if new evidence raises safety concerns. They are approved for specific food categories, with restrictions and maximum levels clearly defined.
However, unlike calories, salt, sugar or vitamins, additives don't have recommended daily allowances. When we asked how consumers can track their intake, the agency explained that additives are assigned an acceptable daily intake, or ADI, the amount considered safe to consume daily over a lifetime. They added that authorisations assume all foods use additives at maximum levels, ensuring average diets remain below the ADI. Additives with low ADIs are less widely authorised to limit exposure. After speaking to Tim Spector, I wanted to explore the research he mentioned further. Cutting out emulsifiers entirely feels drastic, especially when they're everywhere, and we don't yet fully understand their effects. I've tracked down one of the leading researchers in this field, but we'll hear from him later. First, I've scheduled a call with food historian Annie Gray to unpack how we got here and what's the story behind these additives.
So emulsifiers have been used for a very, very long time, but the emulsifiers that were used for most of history were natural emulsifiers. The history of modern emulsifiers, in terms of something that we can add to what we would now regard as an ultra-processed food, is relatively recent. So there's a man called Maurice Goby, who is French. He was the first person to isolate the emulsifier that you can get from egg yolk in 1846. And then that sort of history continued on really through the 20th century. But the emulsification industry, as we would know it today, really comes out of the 1930s. And it's very much a history tied up with really nameless scientists who were working as part of teams of people within industry, looking at either developing new emulsifiers or, of course, of developing better versions of the ones that were out there already, or new uses for ones that were out there already as well.
These new emulsifiers, did it take off quickly when they were first introduced to the market?
It did, because the period when they were developed, the key periods from about 1910 through to about 1950 for the early emulsifiers, especially things like margarine and ice cream, which were two of the key foods in that early period, once they were invented, they were so useful. They allowed chemists, engineers to make food much cheaper, to make food tastier, to make it look better. Later on, the real boom time for emulsifiers was post-Second World War, so sort of 1950 onwards. At that point, it was just an explosion, because emulsifiers are absolutely key in so many manufactured foods, whether it's having a cake crumb that feels really nice or being able to make a cake in the microwave, things that people seem to want.
So did emulsifiers in their emergence, did it change how accessible certain foods were to any particular social or economic groups of people?
Anything that has high levels of additives tends to be cheaper. It's one of the reasons why additives are used. Cheaper and more shelf-stable. And that means that inevitably they tend to be bought more by lower socioeconomic groups. And it's got to be said, it's especially a problem now where we all talk about the cost of living crisis and we are all very much seeing our food prices rising. But in this country, we only spend about 10% of our income on food because so many other things are very expensive. So in this country, you see, for example, the statistics vary quite a lot, but up to 70% of the intake of teenagers is ultra-processed foods, which inevitably mainly will contain emulsifiers.
What about the public perception of emulsifiers and how it's changed from when they first came about to the modern view of an emulsifier?
I think for a long time, most people haven't cared. Is my food cheap? Does it taste nice? Oh, brilliant. Look at this margarine that I can fry in. Amazing. You get so many recipe books from that era where they don't even say fat or butter. They just say Marge. So I think for most of the history of emulsifiers, they've been seen as either not a thing or they've been embraced as part of this brave new world of food, which is going to do what we want it to. We've harnessed nature. That's not quite true in terms of the specialist nutritional establishment. I mean, right in the 1940s, you had some people saying, we're quite worried about what's happening to our food. They weren't focused on emulsifiers per se, but on high levels of processing. But they were labelled as food faddists and dismissed. And this is especially the case in the States, where, of course, the lobbying groups have such power over governmental policy. I mean, you had a food day founded in the States in 1975, where you have leading food scientists saying, come on, we have to stop eating this stuff. And they're just regarded as this weird kind of culty people who are just out on a limb because actually we really, really like this stuff. So it is a very, very recent trend that ultra-processed food has started to become a set of words that we recognise. It's a very recent phenomenon that we even question how much we put in our food.
Food historian Annie Gray. Let's hear now from someone who used to work in the food industry. John Ruff spent his career working for some of the biggest food companies, including Kraft. He retired from there 15 years ago and now works with the Institute of Food Technologists as their chief science advisor. It's a non-profit scientific organisation for people working in the food industry.
An emulsifier usually is something that has what's called a hydrophilic, which is a water-loving end, and a hydrophobic, which is a water-hating or oil-loving, in other words, end. And it effectively acts as a link between the oil and water and brings it together. So you pick the particular emulsifiers that work best in the medians you've got. Nearly every food we've got to some degree has a level of oil in it. The emulsifier group also includes gums, stablers and thickeners. And the reason for that is they also act to stabilize emulsions. They make products you could not make otherwise. For instance, it is pretty difficult to make a lot of baked goods without emulsifiers. And of course, they're used at home. They're used by artisan bakers who somehow are not called UPF, even though it's the same product.
But they've been extracted, haven't they? So there's been a certain amount of processing that has gone on versus using it in its natural form.
Absolutely. And by extracting them, you're making them purer. So you're actually getting the active ingredient you want. You may actually, in some cases, be taking away things you'd prefer not to have. But perhaps more importantly is by doing that, you're able to get a more stable, better product that is going to be more functional and is going to be able to provide stable foods. You know, the emulsifiers are critical to do that.
Do you think there's been a strong enough case made to connect the emulsifiers in our food and our gut health?
It's a good question because that's an area that's getting a lot of research. I would argue we're still at the very early stages of understanding the microbiome. And yes, there are studies that have been recently published that talk about the emulsifiers and the effect in the gut. And I'm quite sure they do. But I think the thing you have to remember is the level of emulsifiers in our food supply is incredibly small. They're usually used at less than 1%, less than 100th of the content of the food. And one of the concerns I have is we focus so much on additives and emulsifiers like this that have been used at very low levels. And it takes away the focus on the macronutrients and the major issues, which we know, and we've known over 50 years, have harmful effects to us from a point of view of obesity and health. One of the reasons why I suspect the correlations that have been found between ultra-processed foods and obesity, which certainly are fairly well established, you cannot untangle the fat, salt, and sugar levels in those and other unhealthy aspects. You can't untangle the low fiber content. All things that we've known for 30, 40, 50 years. So, ultra-processed foods, certainly there is a significant number of them that we should eat very selectively and in moderation. And there's a lot of them that we should probably eat as much as we possibly can. And that's, again, one of my sort of problems with the definition and the way in which it's used.
John Ruff from the Institute of Food Technologists speaking to me from Chicago. Time now for some more tasting. I was told by Nicola and Ross at Sous Chef that emulsifiers don't add flavour, but they can help intensify flavours, and they definitely help with texture. So, what do dietary emulsifiers really do to how we experience food? And does it even matter? I visited the chiller section at a big supermarket before heading to meet Professor Barry Smith at the University of London Centre for the Study of the Senses.
He started by telling me about some of the ways emulsifiers are used to improve manufactured foods, aside from simply creating emulsions.
Well, you can think of, how do I prevent my ice cream from melting so quickly? How do I make sure a cake mix is going to have just the right texture? How do I make sure sugar crystals don't pop up everywhere and are spread throughout? There's enormous amount of work done by emulsifiers. It's kind of like the set of golf clubs that people in the food industry have. They all do different jobs.
So we've been shopping, and I wanted you to help me have a look at some of these products to see which emulsifiers are in them, and if you could just help me determine what exactly the emulsifiers are doing. You ready?
Yes, nice challenge. Happy to do that. Okay, so here we've got chocolate drinks, and we've got a natural chocolate drink which contains whole milk, raw cane sugar, cocoa powder, as you'd expect, and natural vanilla. Now, there's nothing in there that we'd object to, but as it lies still, it will separate a little bit into sort of wetter part and a thicker part. On the other hand, we've got a nice industrially designed and formatted chocolate flavoured drink. And if we look at the ingredients in here, what do we have? Well, we have whole milk, we have sugar, syrup, buttermilk, cocoa powder, fine. Modified maize, starch, fructose, stabilizers. Now, what are they? Cellulose gum, carrageenan. They're called stabilizers, but they're also a range of emulsifiers. So one thing that an emulsifier is doing is stabilizing the product, putting it into a consistent viscosity that stays fixed. The shelf life of the natural product is going to be pretty short, whereas this one, because it's stabilized, that's going to last longer.
Okay, so shall we try them? Should we try both of them?
Okay, I will shake up the natural one. So let's have a bit of that. Looks nice. Milk consistency to it. And the other one, slightly gloopier. Definitely a difference in texture here.
So the chocolate milk number one, I can see little white bits floating in it.
You can. If you think of what emulsifiers are doing, they may be changing the distribution of both flavour and colour. So here we've got a bit of separation, bit of milky stuff floating to the top. In the other, not at all. So let's try the natural one first. Cheers.
That is very nice chocolate milk, but I would say those milk solids, you can feel them.
You can feel them.
It's not unpleasant. In fact, it feels perfectly fine, but it's not the most appetising thing to look at.
So it's not behaving as a homogeneous, uniform liquid. Yeah. Let's try the other one. Cheers.
Okay, cheers.
Amazingly mouth-coating.
Yeah. That is so creamy.
It's already richer, more viscous, but there's also an intensity of the flavour being delivered, almost too much. And it remains a little bit too long in the mouth. It's not clean.
It's suspiciously long. What's fascinating is the second milk drink. It feels a lot nicer on the tongue, very silky, but I don't actually like it. I think I preferred the first one with the milk lumps. Okay, what's next? Should we have a look at some yogurts?
Yes.
We tried two. Both are described as 0% fat. The first is a natural one with no flavours or additives. The second is a fruit-flavoured one made with milk and
oligofructose, fibre, starches. The stabilizers, which will be emulsifiers, are pectin and guar gum. So let's try and see the difference in mouthfeel. And because one is flavoured and one is not, I'm going to invite you to take some of the flavour away by using this medical nose clip.
Okay. There's clip on.
Let's try the natural one first.
It just tastes like lovely yogurt.
Yogurt. Okay. So let's compare it to its additive cousin.
Oh, that's much creamier.
Thicker, creamier.
Yeah, but in a different way. It's almost lighter in its creaminess in some aspects, but it feels physically thicker.
Yes.
How is it doing that?
With the combination of emulsifiers it has in there, it's slipping across the tongue faster. And that slipperiness is what they've used to give the impression of fat, even though it's not there. The brain will feel that's probably fat. So the pectin and guar gum are ensuring that it has enough viscosity, but not just viscosity. It's got to have that slipperiness too.
Okay, so Next, we've got some Spanish lemon cheesecake, and these are plant-based, so they're vegan and gluten-free.
And it's in a glass jar, showing that everything's where it should be, nice separation of the parts.
To be fair, it's a cheesecake. We expect a separation of the parts.
We do.
Oh, that's nice. They've used coconut in this, haven't they? So looking at what's in this, let's play Spot the Emulsifier. Okay, so we've got soya protein concentrate, agar, carrageenan. They seem to be the headline emulsifiers.
Yeah, carrageenan is a very regularly used emulsifier. I think there's something interesting because the separation of the parts suggests different textures. And yet there's a sort of, again, homogenized feel to it. You get something that's, as it were, simulating crunch and texture, but it's really disappearing fast in the mouth. You're not really chewing on very much, and you're getting that thick, creamy paste carrying everything away. I mean, I consumed the first mouthful in milliseconds flat, and I was in for the second. So what those property modifications of texture are doing is making it soft, very easy to consume fast, and maybe we'll eat more than we really need to.
So this connection between emulsifiers and eating more of the stuff perhaps we shouldn't be eating. I mean, what are your thoughts generally on that?
I think that's a bonus of emulsifiers. I mean, remember, emulsifiers are this all-purpose toolkit to improve food. So we're making something soft in the mouth, well lubricated, easy to consume, slippery like fat, all the desirable things that as human eaters we crave, will get us to regularly go back and back for more.
Professor Barry Smith at the University of London Centre for the Study of the Senses. Next, we have two researchers whose work could be pivotal in understanding the future use of emulsifiers, and they have quite different takes on this. One is at the forefront of research concerned with health impacts. But first, the emulsifiers of the future. Professor Anwesha Sarkar is an award-winning expert in colloids and surfaces at Leeds University's School of Food Science and Nutrition, who is working on the development of new emulsifiers.
Past 10 to 20 years, there has been a lot of focus to move towards more naturally sourced emulsification strategies like, plant proteins. The reason being consumers are wary about things. So, for example, if they see the term monoglycerides, they might get, oh my God, I don't know what I'm eating. In our lab, we do a lot of work with plant proteins where you can extract them. So you take, let's say, a pea flour, you can extract the protein itself, which has a lot of interesting emulsification behavior. So you remove, let's say, the polysaccharide part, take the protein, which has emulsification behavior.
Could you tell me about the research you're doing with regards to emulsifiers?
So one of the research area which we are interested in is Pickering stabilization. Pickering showed that you can actually stabilize emulsions with particles. So we are developing a lot of work in our lab where we use naturally sourced particles like cellulose, protein particles, how without any cleaning process, how you can use those to stabilize emulsion. So that's very lucrative because, you are not adding any further processing to it. The other area we are looking how we can replace, for example, egg in the entire supply chain because of sustainability reasons. What we see is that, for example, potato protein is a fantastic material which is very underexploited. So we are looking at those kind of sources to see if we can replace current emulsifiers where there is more eco-friendliness needed in the supply chain.
You use an interesting phrase there. You use the phrase cleaner. Could you just delve a little bit more into what that means?
So we hear this term clean label and cleaner a lot where people are thinking about things that they use in their kitchen. When the E numbers were introduced, they were actually to help consumer to reduce the long name. But somehow when I talk about this to my neighbors, they will say, oh, it looks a little bit, they have added chemicals to it. So that's why if you do the same job and say this is pea protein, but pea protein is actually acting as an emulsifier, that gives me kind of the consumers a saving grace that, oh, it is natural. But fundamentally, it is doing the same job. So this is about more, I believe, about perception. So we are working a lot on this area where you can use just maybe protein to do both jobs. One, maybe, increase the nutritional content, but also provide the emulsification that you need. And that will help you to reduce your labeling, for example. So you have 5-line labeling. That will reduce it down to, 4 lines, 3 lines, 2 lines, or whatever. And that gives you a belief that, okay, it's made of so little number of ingredients. It's much more like what we do in the kitchen.
Professor Anwesha Sarkar from the University of Leeds. Now to Paris. And at the Institut Pasteur, the world-renowned non-profit research institute that's dedicated to the study of microorganisms, diseases and vaccines, Dr. Benoit Chassan is a research director, and he now runs a lab looking at microbiota and its role in health and disease. Much of his research has been with dietary emulsifiers, something he first began working on in 2012 while working in the United States.
So we did a lot of different studies on this impact, and first looking at the effect on the mice, what we observed is that those compounds can directly impact and alter the microbiota from those animals. So killing some good bacteria and favoring the outgrowth of some detrimental bacteria. And this was always associated with bad consequences for the mouse. And for example, we observed that those mice that were eating or drinking dietary emulsifiers, they were developing more colitis or colitis that were much more severe.
Colitis is swelling or inflammation of the large intestine, and in mice is similar to human inflammatory bowel disease, or IBD. How much of the emulsifiers and which emulsifiers were you feeding to the mice and for how long?
Most of the studies that we did in the past were focusing on 2 of them, carboxymethylcellulose and polysorbate 80, because they are very commonly used by the food industry. And since we were using only one compound at a time, we were using relatively high dose because we wanted to mimic general daily exposure of a human being to those compounds. But it's a very complex family of food additives, and we think that they are not all acting in the same way. So currently we are doing experiments in mice and also in humans, trying to look at the cocktail effects and trying to mimic more the normal, regular, daily exposure of human to those compounds.
I've also been told that there's a connection between emulsifiers and type 2 diabetes. In what way?
So we observed that in mice also, and there is epidemiological data also. You can look at dietary habits of healthy participants and see if the people that are eating or drinking a lot of dietary emulsifiers, if they will develop any type of disease after a certain time of exposure. And the Nutrinet Santé cohort found that among the participants that are exposed a lot to dietary emulsifiers, there is an increased risk of various cancer, there is an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, but also type 2 diabetes. Again, this is purely correlation. What we found in mice is those compounds can actually drive type 2 diabetes or at least metabolic deregulation. And we think that this is related to inflammation. We know that chronic low-grade inflammation will always favor the apparition of type 2 diabetes on the long run in mice. And this is exactly what we observed in mice models. So we think that in human also, maybe those compounds, by altering the microbiota and by favoring chronic inflammation, they can drive type 2 diabetes in human as well.
The safety of additives, including emulsifiers, is reviewed and assessed in the UK by the Food Standards Agency, and they're also reviewed internationally by the joint FAO and the WHO Expert Committee on Food Additives, known as JECFA. We're told that to date there are no safety concerns which have been found with regards to these additives. Do you know if your research has been assessed by JECFA or any other food safety organisation?
So they definitely know our research and they have been aware of our research, and I've been also discussing with some members of these committees. And yet dietary emulsifiers are tested only for their acute toxicity as well as for their ability to induce DNA mutation. And for sure, they are not able to induce acute toxicity nor to induce DNA damage. What we observed is much more longer, much more chronic. I think what's clearly missing for them to look into this more carefully is the human relevance. And for this, we are currently wrapping up a very ambitious clinical trial in human with more than 150 IBD patients that are exposed or not exposed to dietary emulsifiers. And we hope with the results, and depending on what we found, of course, we hope that this is going to help the Food Agency to change their view on dietary emulsifiers.
As someone who does so much research into emulsifiers, which ones would you classify as good and which ones would you classify as bad?
So that's still a work in progress. What we have found is, for example, mono and diglyceride of fatty acid are relatively safe and they are very commonly used by the food industry. So again, it's not like all dietary emulsifiers are bad and should be avoided.
But judging on your research, the two that you would be concerned about, the two that you fed to the mice, the carboxymethyl cellulose and the polysorbate 80.
Yes, and as well as carrageenan. We have also reported using an in vitro microbiota system that carrageenan are very, very potent in their ability to detrimentally impact the microbiota. So we think that carrageenan also are very bad emulsifiers, if I can say.
Dr. Benoit Chassang from the Institut Pasteur in Paris. So what do we do now while more research is being carried out? Choosing what to eat can be complex, especially when budgets are tight and time is short. For a final thought, I put this dilemma to Professor Tim Spector. What does he believe we should be eating?
Firstly, to eat as much real food as you can that doesn't contain emulsifiers.
What do you mean by real food?
I mean that's not made in a factory from extracts of other food and that you can buy in a shop and you can cook it yourself and you see exactly what's going into it. And if the majority of the time you're eating that way and you're eating mainly a plant-based diet, and I recommend people try and eat 30 different types of plant a week. If they're doing that, they're getting plenty of fibre, plenty of nutrients, and maybe they eat the rainbow, maybe have some fermented foods, they're eating more beans and legumes and less meat. And if they try and reduce the ultra-processed food they're eating to minimal levels, they don't have to then worry too much about it. So I can have the occasional biscuit that inevitably has got emulsifiers in it without worrying too much. So I think if people are sensible and they move to a largely healthy diet that's good for their gut will be able to cope with small amounts of these ultra-processed foods, and we can enjoy them as rare treats without getting too obsessed with all the food we eat. Because there is a danger in this that some people will overreact and become rather food phobic. But I think the key is if the majority of the food you eat is healthy, your gut then gets healthy and you can cope with the odd bit of these chemicals that ideally you'd avoid, but you can deal with small amounts of them.
Professor Tim Spector. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the programme. It was presented by me, Jaega Wise, and was produced in Bristol for BBC Audio by Natalie Donovan.
Hello, this is Danny Robbins. 3 years ago, I was told one of the scariest stories we have ever had on Uncanny.
The entire room erupts. There are things flying around all over the place.
In 1973, a young climber called Phil spent the most terrifying night of his life in an abandoned house in the Scottish Highlands.
We're absolutely terrified. And we hear this thing going around the building.
Now, we are going back there with Phil, returning to Louisbelt, 50 years on, to confront whatever he experienced there. There it is, Phil.
Yeah, that's it, all right.
Poking up over the hill like a grim spectre. How are you feeling? You okay?
Nervous.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Subscribe to Uncanny on BBC Sounds.